So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Svejnar. I'm director of the Center on Global Economic Governance that's co-organizing this event. And it's my pleasure to welcome you here. I'll be moderating the event. The other sponsoring institution is the Center on Capitalism and Society, and also the Initiative for Policy Dialogue. So the three institutions are bringing together this group of speakers and commentators discussing the book Whither the World, the Political Economy of the Future. And it is an honor to welcome the book's author, Professor Grzegorz Kolodko. He is professor of economics and founder and director of the Tiger Center, Transformation, Integration, and Globalization Economics Research at Kosminski University in Warsaw. It's a real pleasure for me to welcome him. He's an old friend. We've run into each other on many occasions. As many of you know, he's the architect of Poland's successful economic reforms. He served as the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance in Poland. He's also the author of numerous books and articles, notably the international bestsellers From Shock to Therapy, The Political Economy of Post-Socialist Transformation, also the book Truth, Errors, and Lies, Politics and Economics in a Volatile World. His book Whither the World, The Political Economy of the Future, addresses the challenges that are facing us all in the long-term future in the global economy. It employs a holistic approach in answering fundamental questions about the threats and opportunities that lie ahead and the proposed strategies by the author in moving forward. Now, joining Professor Kolodko today on the panel are Professors Edmund Phelps and Joseph Stiglitz. As you know, Professor Phelps is the M. Vicker Professor of Political Economy here at Columbia University, director of the Center on Capitalism and Society that's co-sponsoring today's event. He received the 2006 Nobel Prize in Economics for a range of fundamental contributions to macroeconomic theory. His work can be seen in many guises. One is how to put people as we know them back into economic models, accounting for the incompleteness of their information. More recently, looking at sources of dynamism behind nations' indigenous innovation. On his way here from class is Professor Joseph Stiglitz, university professor at Columbia and co-founder and co-president of the Initiative for Policy Dialogue that's co-sponsoring tonight's event. He was awarded the 2001 Nobel Prize in Economics for his analysis of markets with asymmetric information. And he was also the lead author, as many of you will recall, of the 1995 report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which shared the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. His most recent books are The Great Divide, Unequal Societies and What We Can Do About Them, and Creating a Learning Society, a New Approach to Growth, Development, and Social Progress. I will be moderating and also participating in the discussion. So I'm pleased to welcome Professor Kolodko. Please join me in welcoming him to give the initial remarks.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much indeed for this invitation. I do appreciate it to be here again because it happened that I was with the book presentation three years ago when Columbia University Press has published my book, Truth, Errors, and Lies, Politics and Economics in the Volatile World. But having this book written, I came back to the very fundamental, if not the most difficult question, whither the world, what future we may expect, we may wish, we may create. One may say, whither the world, such a simple question. So I'm trying to answer it. But the more I'm committed to the research to this end, the more I'm convinced that economic is not a discipline of science. Economic is a multidisciplinary knowledge. To answer the question, what is going on in the contemporary world economy, what's going on with the mankind, with culture, with security, with environment, with progress and regress, one has to take a holistic interdisciplinary view, and traditional mainstream economics is absolutely too short to deliver a proper answer. Therefore, I'm starting with the conviction, a deep conviction that only multidisciplinary and not an orthodox but heterodox approach, a holistic analysis can give us certain insight what the future will be like. It's a risky business to talk about the future. My book, Whither, the World, the Political Economy of the Future, is not a forecast. I'm not a forecaster. If you want to read a good book, I think the best forecast available, this is a book by Jürgen Randers, 2052, next 40 years of the world economy. He was a part of the Meadows team, which produced the first Club of Rome report in 1972, Limits to Growth. And after 40 years, he is back now with much better instruments for long-term forecasting. That's a picture of the processes for next 2 generations as they may happen according to this forecast. My methodology is that I'm saying that if our beautiful science, because it is the beautiful one, as long as it is science, not an ideology too much inclined to left or to right, or a lobbying, economics as a beautiful science, and if it is useful, must say us something, how the things will work in the future. What will be the mechanism of the events, of the processes of sensu largo, economic nature, what will happen with growth, competitiveness, development, balancing the economy, demographic processes, competitiveness, regional integrations, globalization, and so on. And there are certain things which seems to be quite clear, and they are very much complex that we don't even know an answer what the situation may be in a term of a quarter or a year. But I'm taking a long-term view that's about the future in decades or 1 or 2 generations. From such a perspective, I'm talking about the future first showing the events and the processes which are unavoidable. They will happen, do we like it or not? So can we do anything if they will happen disregarding our wish and so on? Well, we have to know that they will happen and then to adjust, maybe in a different way in US and in a different way in sub-Saharan Africa, in a different way if one is rich and in a different way when one is catching up. What is unavoidable future, for instance, with the paramount economic consequences? Say, the fact that around 2050, and that's not that important, is it going to be 2 years later or earlier, will be about 9 billion people. Will be about 9 billion people, being now 7.2 billion, with all the consequences, the economic one, the social one, the ecological one, and maybe not even maybe, for sure, with some implications for security. But there's very many things, again, the issues, the processes, which may happen or may not. I'm coming to you from a very interesting place in the world. They are only interesting place in the world. There are not any boring places. I explored over 160 countries, and I can assure you that everywhere is very interesting. But I'm coming from Poland, and Poland's supposed to join Euro. That's given by our treaty, our accession treaty, which we signed in April of 2003, 12 years ago. But this is possible, but not unavoidable. It may happen or it may not. It depends on very many factors. So now we need a good economist and a good policymaker which has to revisit the issue and say, okay, is it going to be good for Poland's economy? Is it going to be good for enlargement of the euro, common currency zone, and under what circumstances is going to happen or not to happen? Grexit. That is also the future, which is possible, but not unavoidable. And again, it calls for axiology. We have to know what we want. And then the question is, who are we? Because actually economics is a science about contradicting economic interests. If there is not a contradiction between the interests, we do not need the economist. If there is the choice to pick up a girl which is beautiful and rich, or the one which is ugly and poor, there is not a problem of choice. We know after which one we have to go. But if the poor is very beautiful and the ugly is extremely rich, we do need economists, because we have to make the choice. We have to know what is the agenda, what actually is the aim, which is not supposed to be confused with the ends. So there is plenty of things in the future which may happen or may not, vis-a-vis economic growth, the limits to economic growth, income distribution, competitiveness, regional integration processes, trade, savings, investment, etc., where a good economic analysis is very much in demand, is required, but an answer for the question is impossible as long as we don't know what is the aim of an economic activity. And from this perspective, I'm writing that we are already in beyond GDP reality. And beyond GDP reality calls for beyond GDP economics, upon which must be based beyond GDP economic policy and strategy for development. It's even more important than that, because we are at the era of globalization. My definition of globalization is that it is historical and spontaneous, if not chaotic, process of first liberalization and then integration of thus far separately to the extent performing national economies into one interconnected, interdependent, worldwide, global, planetary economy. So if that is the case, the question is it irreversible, or it may be put on the reverse? My train of thought suggests that this is the irreversible process. There are two powerful forces on technological and political, on economic and cultural side, unleashed, that the process could be put on the reverse. Yet it is bumpy. There are ups and downs, and actually the recent financial and then economic and then social and then political and then cultural crisis we do have now, which actually has started not far away from this place in this great city of New York a couple of years ago, is making globalization a little bit more challenging, but it's not putting the process on the reverse. There is a little bit more of protectionism, there is a little bit more of chauvinism or nationalism, which here and there is called economic patriotism, France for French, Germany for Germans, Poland for Polish, protection for American industries, etc. But that is not the force which can put this process back where we were decades and centuries ago. So if globalization is irreversible, then one of the critical issues for the future, which now is, again, big question mark, is regional integration processes. It's not that much disputed here in the US as it is in my part of the world, in Europe, because we do have European Union, which is in a kind of crisis quite different from the American one. We have the Eurozone, we have the process of deepening and enlargement of the European integration, and now very many economists, including very influential economists and policymakers, they have the second thought. And actually the future of the European Union is not a kind of unavoidable continuation of integration process. It may break down. It's very unlikely, but it is not impossible. Dissolution of euro, common currency zone, is more likely now than, say, 5 years ago, because completely extreme mismanagement of the Greek crisis. And this mismanagement is much more caused by IMF, Brussels, than by the Greek government. And it can be a very severe blow for the process of integration of Europe. But the process of integration of Europe is not our cup of the tea. We are being observed by Mercosur and by ASEAN, by NAFTA and by Gulf Council, by CIS and SARRC in India and Iran, that is by other regional integration processes, and if European project will fail, that will be a very big blow for the regional integration processes, which I see not as contradictory to globalization, but rather as the processes which are enhancing and streamlining and enforcing globalization as such. Having said so, I'm talking in my books about 12 great issues of the future with capital letters, G-I-F, great issues of the future. I'm starting in the new book with the word, with the values. The values, how they're supposed to change if we want to sustain peaceful, inclusive, relatively balanced social and economic development. And without going into the details into all of these 12 issues, which I think are most important for the long-term future. First, I think is absolutely the ecological matter and climate change. That is the question of to be or not to be in terms of generations, and for that reason, forthcoming Paris summit in December of this year and other gatherings will be very critical one, but actually we can warm the climate too much. That is possible. That is the not unavoidable future. So the question is, do we have an economic knowledge? Is there an economic theory upon which we can base economic strategy to contain such a risk? Yes, we the economists, we know what to do, but we don't have yet the political ability to go to this end. Second greatest issue and challenge, it's a demographic process. We will be 9 billion people, but the problem is that in certain part of the world, there will be too many people, and in some of them, there is not enough of us already. In some regions, we are aging too fast, and in some, we are still getting advantage of so-called demographic dividend, what is seen now clearly if one compares, for instance, the most two populous economies of the world, that is India, where we have the positive demographic dividend, and China, which is aging, not yet as much as Japan, but somehow similar. The rate birth in the world now is slightly over 2.4 kids per woman, but it goes from 6.9 in very poor Niger to 0.8 in very rich Singapore. It is simply unsustainable. It's absolutely unsustainable, and it is causing very big problems. You have to see the recent yesterday, today, and tomorrow tragedies at the Mediterranean Sea, where so many people are drowning, just as one more reflection of this demographic pressure, that there are the regions where there is too many people, and there are the regions where we are looking for a labor. And of course, there is the question of the diversification of the standard of living. So the third biggest question for the future, this is the income distribution. It's interesting that recently there is much more debate about income distribution, yet the issue is not a new one, the challenge is not the new one, and our knowledge is already quite comprehensive where the inequality is coming from. Yet there is not a political consensus how to tackle the issue. But it is absolutely unsustainable. It is unsustainable in China, and it is absolutely unacceptable and unsustainable in the United States. I've seen today on CNN a very telling difference. What is the difference of the opinion of the electorate of Democrats and Republicans? It's completely like in two nations, yet still this is the same nation of the North America. Is it justified or not justified that you have such a big income inequality without going into the details? But actually, if you will take a closer look where from is so-called Arab Spring, a couple of years, and still there is not any kind of spring. Only yesterday they imprisoned a democratically elected president of Egypt for 20 years, and I don't hear that many protests even from, say, the American White House and elsewhere, that actually he's been democratically elected president. This is politics, so let's go back to economics. But Arab Springs has been caused somehow by inequality. Occupy London, occupy Wall Street, and so on, and we'll have much more problems in the future because this kind of income and wealth distribution, which has been brought till today by two biased type of capitalism, is unsustainable. And this two biased type of capitalism, it is on the one hand neoliberal capitalism, which is taking advantage of the great deal ideas of liberal society, economy and polity, and by weakening the state and financial market is working on the behalf of enriching the few at the cost of many. This type of future is rather leading to another great conflict and crisis, but I wouldn't bet on state capitalism, which is quite different in Belarus and Venezuela, different in Saudi Arabia and Russia, different in China and Egypt, but I would say in each of these countries we do have a kind of state capitalism. So therefore I'm coming with something what I refer to as new pragmatism. Definitely market economy, but much more social oriented, with more equitable and inclusive growth based on heterodox economic thinking. It's not a time for mainstream orthodox economics, put within the framework of irreversible globalization with support for regional integration processes and taking care of this post-GDP, beyond GDP economics that is a quest for triple balance. If you want to have good future, if not a better future, for billions of people here and there, of course, it must be growing economy, but one more time, this pace of growth, 3-4%, is unsustainable in the longer run. The world economy has to slow down to leave the ecological space, especially for catching up countries, to which I refer not as to emerging markets, which is another neoliberal notion, but I'm referring to them as emancipating economies. So the name of the game is how to sustain, in the longer run, triple balance development, not only economic one, what we love to talk about, saving investment, production, input-output, export-import, revenue expenditure, and so on. But on the one hand, what we in Europe call social cohesion, that is a kind of social balance, that people will accept the way we are solving the problems which we'll have so many in the future. And on the other hand, an ecological balance that is the balance between us, between mankind, our economic activity, and Mother Nature. So the question is how to coordinate the policies to facilitate such a triple balance growth. To conclude, I would say that from an institutional economic viewpoint, the critical, the paramount, the fundamental question, challenge is how to govern the global economy. If indeed globalization is an irreversible process, we have to find the way to coordinate the policies on the global agenda, on the worldwide scale. We try. We do have some organizations, we do have some experience, we try here and there. Is it G20 or G7, UN, or this or that Bretton Woods organization, or some new projects like, for instance, Asian Infrastructure Development Bank, and so on, so on. The things are dynamic, the things change, but only vis-a-vis such an approach we may find a proper solution, because most of the challenges are going beyond national economy, and thinking within the limit of national economy is too short to deliver. So therefore the biggest challenge for the future is how to govern the world economy at the era of irreversible globalization, if it is indeed irreversible, as I'm assuming in my train of thought. So that is what I'm trying to answer in my books. Somehow the publisher, this time Palgrave Macmillan, decided to publish the book in 2 volumes, not in 1. And then they asked me, Professor, maybe you have this suggestion for cover. I don't know why they did ask me for that suggestion, but if they did ask, I answered politely, and I said a couple of photographs because I'm making picture when I'm traveling, and they have selected for the volume 1 this picture. In this Christian hand, you can see a beautiful Islam girl hand. I took the picture at Sahara Desert somewhere in Djibouti, in corner of Africa. That's my answer. That's Greg Kolodko answer towards Huntington Clash of Civilization. There is no room for clash of civilization. We have to look for the multiculturalism as a way to go forward. We have to learn how to be more open and more tolerant in this interconnected world economy. And on the second volume, they have selected the picture, the photo, which I have taken at Mont Athos. That is the peninsula closed for 1,000 years for women by the edict of the Emperor of Byzantium, who forbidden entry for women and female animals already in 1060, 1,000 years ago. And this is the bell from one monastery, and that says, don't ask for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for tea. So I'm very glad that we have this initiative of Columbia University to discuss the issues which I'm touching in my books. Thank you very much again for the invitation, and now I'm here to learn from the discussants and from you. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. And we'll start with Professor Phelps, followed by Professor Stiglitz. Ned, thank you very much.
Shall I speak here from the table?
You can speak right here, yes.
Yeah. Well, it's important to hear voices from a different place and a different time from one's own. This two-volume work is mainly concerned with whether the global economy, as it develops further over the next few decades, is going to be governable. What I would say there is that the global economy does not need to be governed in any thorough way, but it may need some sort of governance on particular points. For example, I've begun to worry that if the United States experienced some structural shift that sent it into a depression, not a recession such as the one from which the U.S. has recently recovered, but something more permanent than that, there would be no possibility of a real exchange rate depreciation, because the rest of the world doesn't want to see its currencies appreciate. I suspect that not all of the problems like that can be fixed. Maybe the world will have to soldier on with a flawed system for global economic trade and investment. I wonder whether in the second point, I wonder whether in the small and medium-sized economies there is an exaggerated, that there is a somewhat excessive preoccupation with the global economy. France had a great decade in the 1920s, even though the rest of the world was in considerable turmoil, or most of it was. Once Germany merged with Prussia in 1871, the new country had a brilliant economy, while the Netherlands, Italy, and Spain did not. They continued to flounder and just sort of borrow from what was going on in the more dynamic places. Although luck is important, my look at economic history suggests to me that the economic success of a country is mostly its own doing. It is not made by the rest of the world. In fact, it can't be made by the rest of the world. You have to do it yourself. I'd love to go on about what Professor Kolodko said, but sorry, but I need to take up what is not in Professor Kolodko's book, because I'd like to hear him comment on my remarks, and because I think it's very much something missing in the book. As I see it, the entire West is in a malaise that predates the financial crisis. Since 1980, Western continental Europe has seen labor force participation rates fall markedly and employment rates more so. As a result, inclusion of youth and some minorities in the economy, the main route to their maturation and their integration, is more deficient now than it ever was, I think. Among those who do work, fewer are prospering. And judging by survey data and complaints about the workplace, even fewer are flourishing. Another symptom is the slowdowns of productivity. Wage rates have slowed even more. On a different plane, there has been a slow decline of job satisfaction, judging by household surveys and media commentators. Feeling the pressure of low and stagnant revenues, governments resort to steroids, such as manufacturing booms, which creates problems for the future. The declines are unprecedented, so it is not surprising that there is no agreed diagnosis. Joseph Stiglitz, my friend Joe, argues that an increase of inequality at the top is a cause, if not the cause. However, I have to say that Europe has seen little rise of inequality, I believe, and it has all the malaise that the U.S. has, if not more. And with regard to the U.S. data, it's important, I think, to say that the rise of inequality only began in the 1980s. But as I see it, that was many years after the slower growth and the ensuing rise of joblessness arose. Lawrence Summers supposes that a secular deficiency of demand is the cause of a long malaise of the West. But the two best recoveries from the recent financial crisis so far occurred in spite of major cuts in government demand. The controversial welfare cuts in the UK and the sequestration in the US. True, business investment has been weak, but that is not a cause so much as a further symptom needing explanation. Yet, an agreed diagnosis is needed. Without one, governments will go on treating the declines as if they were caused by standard shocks to a structurally unchanged economy. Governments will go on using the same policy tools used to treat common recessions or sags in business confidence. The economics profession is slowly coming to entertain the hypothesis, I think, that the cause of the malady is a deficiency of innovation, originating in the nations once counted on to provide it. Germany, Britain, France, and the US. This hypothesis could serve to explain all the symptoms: slower growth, lower employment, and the rest. But it raises further questions. There's an issue about what brought the losses of innovation and what would bring back the innovation. And that's one of the sources, what have been the sources of innovation that we have to look to again. I argue in my recent book that for a nation to do a lot of innovating of its own, genuine innovating as distinct from copying from other nations, it must do a lot of innovation originating in its economy. It cannot depend on opportunities for innovation brought by exogenous forces, contrary to Schumpeter. The nation needs endogenous innovations, large and small, springing from people engaged in business activity. It needs their imagination and creativity. And how apt people are to innovate depends on the dynamism of the society. People's desire to innovate, their capacity to innovate, the latitude society gives them to innovate. In this view, it was the rise to a critical mass of this dynamism in Britain and America as early as 1815, later in Germany and France, that brought to those countries the takeoffs of productivity into sustained growth, as Walt Rostow dubbed them. Similarly, it was the losses of much of this dynamism, I believe, in one country after another, that have drawn these countries into economic decline. Asking the Europeans to reclaim their former dynamism will be a tall order. They appear to believe that innovation is typically a matter of responding to the needs of customers and solving the engineering problems that arise. Their economics remains deeply classical. There is no room in that economics for imagination, for conceiving the new. Europe needs to reconceive the economy as a thriving organism driven by imagination and fueled by the energy of its people. It must cast off the blocks and the inhibitors to innovation. There's also an issue over what an economic life would be important to regain. Professor Kolodko refers to the need for values in a chapter of his book, and of course, I agree with that. I'm particularly interested in the values that have to do with the notion of the good life. Ultimately, I was driven back to taking a look at Confucius as well as Aristotle. Confucius refers to self-cultivation and Aristotle to acquiring knowledge. In the modern literature, however, we find tenets of individualism, such as pursuing one's happiness, vitalism, such as meeting challenges, self-expression, such as imagining, exploring one's talents, testing one's ideas. Humanists, for a century or two, have been speaking of a life of sufficient richness, a richness that comes only with adventure and struggle. This modern conception of the good life, I think, has implications for careers, for economic life, and hence for what a good economy would be, what it would have to be. A not unfamiliar element of the good life is prospering, gaining expertise in one's work, thus gaining better terms for oneself. It is the active human agency here that makes the experience gratifying. The gaining of the better terms, not the better terms per se. The other element of the good life is flourishing. The delight in imagining, creating, and venturing, the fascination of voyaging into the unknown, and the thrill of succeeding. For most people, flourishing appears to be necessary for the good life. Prospering is not enough. And for most people, the only career paths apt to lead to flourishing are those in a good economy. You can't get it elsewhere. So to conclude my thesis in a fit of purple prose, in the days of Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, when Schumann and Brahms walked the earth, a great many Europeans embraced this modern conception of the good life. They were ready to leap into the unknown in order to pursue the development of their ideas. Europeans are not going to be willing to remake their economy as long as they're unwilling to remake themselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the substance as well as the terrific ending here. Next speaker, Joe.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here to discuss this book. I've known Gregor for a long time. When I was at the World Bank, we were still fighting the battles of the economies of transition, and he was on the right side of those battles. And there were alternative theories of what had led to the successes and failures, and I thought the policies that he had introduced as finance minister, deputy prime minister, were the right policies. And there still is a controversy in Poland about why Poland has been probably the most successful of the economies in transition. And I think it had a lot to do with the kinds of reforms that he introduced when he was there. I'm going to focus my remarks on several issues relating to governance, the euro, the global governance, euro democracy, and then end up with a few remarks about innovation. What we have today in the world is a system of global governance without global government. There's a set of agreements that cover a whole variety of areas. We have international institutions like the World Bank, the IMF. We have actually a quite rich and dense set of institutions. But it is a far cry from anything that would approach global government. But to me, my concern is not that there is not the absence of coherence. It's not the holes in this system that are pretty glaring, but it's actually the way those rules are made. And the reason that's of concern is that, for the most part, there is what might be described as a chimney structure to global governance. The IMF was meeting in Washington this weekend. It was the finance ministers and central banks that were making decisions about the global financial system. They're well-intentioned, but for the most part, they see the world through the eyes of the financial community. That's important, but it's only part of what makes a successful economy. The UN has had an initiative that's been going on now for about 15 years called Finance for Development. And they took the decision, and the UN is the body that brings the governments together around the world. They took the decision that finance was too important to leave to the finance ministers. And I think they were absolutely right. And there was a very important meeting in Monterey on finance for development, and there's another important meeting that will be held in Addis. The problem is that when you don't have the right people at the table and you make the rules, you get the wrong rules. And the result of that is you can get actually global governance that constrains, creates more inequality, and actually doesn't let the global system work well. And as I say, I'm going to illustrate that on two topics, the euro and the trade agreements that are now being negotiated. Before coming to that, I do want to answer a question that Ned has raised and implicit what Gregory's talked about. And that is, has globalization been oversold? Well, I think that we have to recognize probably the most important single event of the last 50, 100 years in terms of economics was the moving of 500 million people out of poverty in China. That's a big deal. And that would not have probably happened without globalization. Globalization of ideas, globalization of technology, globalization of trade. So I think we have to recognize that there's been, I've been a strong critic as anyone of globalization, but this is in no small measure an achievement of globalization. But one also has to recognize that there have been a lot of losers in globalization. And among the losers are many people here in the United States. There's been a big debate about the causes of the growing inequality as well as the consequences. There's no debate about the fact that we've had enormous increases in inequality, that the top 1% gets twice as much as it did 30 years ago. The top 1/10 gets 3 or 4 times as much as a share did before. And the median income, adjusted for inflation today in the United States, is lower than it was 25 years ago. There has been a debate about the relative importance of different forces. Is it globalization, is it trade? Is it globalization trade, or is it technology? And both have played a role. I think the evidence was pretty clear that before 2000, technology played a dominant role. Bruce Greenwald has a really good book that laying out the evidence on that. But since 2000, the numbers are different, and some important studies have identified that those parts of the United States where there have been, which have produced goods that are competing with those imported goods, the surges from China, have had lower wages and more unemployment. Our economic system, basically isn't able to cope with those changes in trade. What I'm going to highlight in a few minutes is that I think that these are always questions of a continuum. Where do you draw the line? How far do you push it? Right now, we're having a debate in the United States about a trade agreement, and I believe that trade agreement is actually very bad for Americans and for most of the other people who will be signing on. To understand that, one has to understand that the trade agreement is not about trade. That might sound strange, but one of the things they do in Washington is label things with a label different from what the bill is about. So if you say, it's a bill about creating jobs, it's about destroying jobs. So whatever it is, you just take the opposite of it. So in this particular case, this is not about free trade. This is about managed trade, and it's managed for special and corporate interest. There are two critical provisions of that bill. One is a set of provisions that is intended to undermine the ability of governments in the U.S. and other countries to regulate. Environmental regulation, health regulation, safety regulations, every regulation, even regulations intended to stabilize our economy. For some reason I don't understand, no one has told the USTR that we had a crisis in 2008. And if any of you have contacts there, you should let them know that we did have a financial crisis in 2008, and that has implications. Now, I'm sounding only slightly facetious. The point is that the rest of the world, and even most people in the United States, recognize that we need tougher regulations in the financial sector. But these financial agreements, these trade agreements, so-called trade agreements, will make it more difficult to have the kind of regulation that will make our economy safe. So the particular provision is something where the U.S. courts and the U.S. Congress have repeatedly rejected. The question is, should you compensate firms when you have a regulation to protect the public, whether it's for the environment, for the economy, for health? And these are called regulatory takings. If you pass a regulation that says you have to label cigarette packages as this is dangerous for your health, the cigarette companies get upset. They say, we're not going to sell as many cigarettes. That was, of course, the purpose of the label. And the labels work. But Philip Morris says, you're taking away our property rights, and you should compensate us for our lower sales. Now, I think that's outrageous. So do American courts. So has the U.S. Congress when they've actually deliberated this issue. But the USTR is trying to do an end run around these democratic processes, and when you're not looking, bury it into the bill. Now, this is where Gregory said is very, very important. What is at stake here is the nature of our democracies. How do rules get made? And to the extent that they get moved to an international arena, it can undermine the effective degree of democracy in our society. None of you will have a direct say, effectively, in this question about regulatory takings. You may not even understand the issue, but it's really important. These are not just imaginary worries. Uruguay, Australia are now being sued under almost identical provisions by Philip Morris against regulations of the kind that we have in New York City. And Mayor Bloomberg is actually, he worked to create them here, and he's now paying for Uruguay to defend itself. And that raises another important issue. A system, a fair system, is one in which everybody has equal access to justice. But justice can be expensive. And the new trade agreements are making it very, very expensive. Because basically they're empowering a group of private lawyers who are called arbitrators, who get millions and millions of dollars for hearing a case, for managing a case. And we used to think that a basic function of our society is providing a judiciary. And this is a process of privatization, the most important part of our society, which is the rule of law. And in privatizing in a way that will mean that there will be no precedents, no appeal, all the safeguards. Now, to give you the highlight, the sense that this is not what it's being advertised. Europe thinks it has a good rule of law. And I think most of you, good system of property protections. These provisions are being sold as property protections. But we're trying to force Europe to have these. And Europe is rightly some countries like Germany are saying, I don't understand. We have a good system of property protection. Why are you saying we have to change ours? And citizens in Germany are saying, if we ought to change it, why should we change it for foreign firms, not for our own firms? If something's wrong with our judicial system, if something's wrong with our system of protection of property rights, we should change it for all our citizens, not just for foreign firms. So what this is really about is big corporations, major campaign contributions to the U.S. government, trying to change our legal structure and using arguments about trade and trying to persuade people, well, we need to keep the process of globalization going unless sliding back is going to hurt us all. I think that's absolute nonsense. A second aspect of the new trade agreement is about intellectual property. Now, intellectual property is part of innovation. I'm going to follow this with some remarks about innovation, but it's not the most important part. When I was in the Council of Economic Advisors, we were debating the kind of provisions, intellectual property, that were eventually put into the Uruguay round into the WTO. And both the Council of Economic Advisors, the Office of Science and Technology Policy said, these provisions are not good for American science, they're not good for global science, they're not good for American health, they're not good for our economy. Who were they good for? America's drug companies and Disney. This is not the way to run an economy. This is a way to undermine democratic processes. Unfortunately, as you all know, I lost. And we got those provisions. But the consequences of having the wrong intellectual property provisions mean not only do drug prices go higher, but health is hurt. An example was actually just in the newspaper today, a really important example. We got the wrong intellectual property frame where in the United States, we said you could patent genes. And then we tried to get everybody else to patent genes. And you might have thought that you owned your own genes, but no. Our legal framework had been that if somebody isolates your genes, they own your genes. Well, this is not just an issue of hypothetical. There was a company called Myriad who got the patent on two genes called the BRCA genes, which if you have those two genes, the probability of coming down with breast cancer is over 50%. And so you really want to know whether you have those genes. But Myriad was not interested in protecting women from dying. They were interested in one thing, profits. So Yale developed a better test for the genes than Myriad. Yale wanted to make this free to everybody. Yale with some donors. And Myriad said no. We want to maximize our profit, and that means we hoard the data. We don't want Yale to get involved. And they were doing this. People died as a result of this. And then I joined with ACLU and a number of other scientific bodies, and we sued, and we went all the way to the Supreme Court. We won in the district court, we lost in the appellate court, and that shows you how fragile these things, and at the Supreme Court we won. And today in the newspaper, there is a report of what has happened since that suit 2 years ago, a flourishing of new innovation, new tests, bringing the cost down to $250 a test so that even people who don't have insurance can afford it, really saving lives. And this would not have been possible under the intellectual property provisions that the U.S. is advocating in these trade agreements. So what we're talking about are the lives of Americans, the lives of people all over the world. And it is an example of this chimney structure. I talked about how finance represents finance. USTR represents producer interest, not the interest of you and me, not the interest of people suffering, come down with the disease, and not interested in innovation, not interest of academia. They serve the interests of big campaign contributors. And we all suffer as a result. Now, just two more very brief points. One on Europe, because Europe is not a global system, but it's a kind of globalization, very intense among a group of countries. Very noble idea, bringing the countries together after all those wars. Hopefully economic integration leading to social, political integration. And it shows when you don't do things right, things can backfire. As I visit Europe, I've never seen the kind of as much polarization as is occurring. Greeks and Germans, Northern Europe and Southern Europe. A democratic deficit that's opened up. Greece wanted, Papandreou proposed having a referendum on the program that had been demanded of Greece by the Troika. A very reasonable thing. You're asking me to ask my citizens to sacrifices that have led to decreases in standard of living somewhere between 25 and 40%. decreases that are greater than the Great Depression, with no end in sight. And it's reasonable to say to the people, do you want this? Do you think that these recipes are going to work? So at least if they do it, they have buy-in. And Germany and Europe said, no, they couldn't have a referendum. There is a democratic deficit, and the point is that, you know, I've become convinced. I in the last couple of weeks, last week we had a meeting with the finance minister from Germany here. The week before, I had a long discussions in Paris with the Greek finance minister. And over the weekend, I talked to the president of at least one of the countries in the EU, and it looks like Europe is heading for a train wreck. And
Nice.
what?
Train wreck. For a train wreck.
That's an expression that things aren't going to go very well, and unless Merkel saves it, or something else happens that. There is a significant probability of things turning out very, very badly. And in fact, if Germany prevails, that too will be a bad outcome, because a situation where youth unemployment is 60%, you're destroying the future of a country, is not a good situation. Finally, let me just say a few words about innovation. Innovation is obviously important. Many people thought America was innovative. We had a very innovative financial market. It created products that blew us up. Now, that illustrates, and our most talented people went into that kind of innovation. And that's testimony to the quality of a Columbia education, because many of them went to Columbia. So, but it's also testimony to another thing, that if you have an economic system that is distorted, that gives rewards that are not commensurate with societal contributions, you get distortions. And, you know, we need innovation for climate change. It may be boring, but it's really important to save the planet. You need, you know, and we've had actually a lot of interesting innovations. The problem is, you know, we now have automatic checkout clerks, so that we have more unemployed, unskilled people. You know, so we've had a lot of innovation. The only problem is they haven't been directed at our society's most important problems. When we think of what leads to the big innovations, we have to say it's disproportionately governments and big corporations. You know, if you look at where the big innovations have come, you know, transistor, laser, the computer, you know, discovery of DNA, all supported by government, or one exception, which was Bell Labs, which was like a government monopoly that both Bruce and I worked at. So you know, and there's a very, I think, very persuasive book called The Entrepreneurial State by Mazzucato, who points out that it is, the big innovations have been coming from the source, not from the garages. But that having been said, it is important to create an innovative society. Bruce and I have this book called, you know, Creating a Learning Society. That's an important part of you know, going back to the Enlightenment. It's a change in mindset. I agree very much with Ned that it really is a question of questions of mindset. It's a question of education. Ned probably hasn't been spending as much time as I have in Silicon Valley. I have a daughter and a nephew in Silicon Valley, and they are very, very excited about their innovation, all their apps, all their, you know, I won't make any comment about the social value. Some of it is very, very valuable, some of it, but there is a sense of excitement. There is a sense of creativity that is going on, and that brings me back to the theme that I said before. It's not that we, at the top in the United States, we have education systems that have actually created a lot of, have created conditions for a lot of creativity and innovation. The real problem is, how are we directing the innovation? Are we actually directing the innovation in ways that create a better functioning society? And let me end at that note.
All right. Thank you very much. We're running a little bit late, but I think we will have time for everything. Let me just make a few very brief comments to follow up on this. I certainly do recommend to you the book, both volumes. I think that the idea that comes from the analysis, and it is a grandiose scheme that is being presented, of this new pragmatism has considerable appeal. The triple balance, the economic, social, and ecological, really is a big thing. And I think the way Ned finished his presentation, I think it relates to this flourishing idea. It really is that, that comes together there. I guess question here is, I'm not so sure that this global system, the way you describe it properly, etc., that it is irreversible completely. I agree that it's an incredible machine that's going forward, but I could imagine if there is a huge, huge depression that Ned was alluding to as a possibility, that the whole world system could lead to incredible waves of protectionism, and while the global forces are incredibly strong, and I agree, hard to overturn, we've seen last century experiments with a third of the global population being hermetically sealed, and it's, who knows what could happen. So I don't have a vision of what could happen, but I can imagine bad things possibly happening. So that's there. I think Joe has identified a whole number of issues that I fully agree with. I was amazed. I was working at the Davidson Institute at the University of Michigan. We sent a delegation to Cancun negotiations at the time, the trade agreement, and the amount of interaction between the government and the large corporations during the negotiations was just striking to all the participants who went there. So actually just observing the interaction where you go for okay from the industry in order to go to the next round of negotiations was striking. And I think the effect on democracy and all this is really a big question that is here. What represents democracy, and nowadays in Europe, right? Who dictates to whom? And the Greeks have elected government that's democratically elected, but who knows whether it will survive, or if it does, and if it pursues what it wants to pursue, what kind of outcome there will be within Europe. So I think that there is, in the microcosm of Europe, which is significant, example of what could become on the global scene, a major set of issues. And here I'd like to point out that if you look at just one statistic that's striking in the dynamic development here, and Ned has studied the dynamism in depth in a number of instances, if we were here in 1990, the share of world GDP of the US and Europe together would be 1/2, 50%. Okay, actually it would be even more than that. Now it's just 40%. Actually at that point it would be close to 60%. So, a huge decline, and mostly Europe, okay? And, but US as well. So it's the most rapid change in relative balance of economic power and equilibrium in the world that's happened in a relatively short span of time. And the situation in Japan over the last 20 years indicating that large successful economies, Japan was predicted to overtake the US in many respects in the late 1980s, early 1990s, but could go, a country like that, economy like that, could go through 20 years of essentially stagnation of very slow growth. So inconceivable outcomes are conceivable, Europe being another example, and many people are asking, after the almost 10 years now of decline and stagnation in Europe, will there be another decade, again 20 years, and possibly even more beyond 20 years? So long-term changes of huge proportions. And here I guess pose the question, it seems to me as I look at the capitalist system and the critique of the neoliberal aspect of it that Greg has in his book, I think is very appropriate. But looking at the capitalist system with all the shortcomings that have been very well identified here, it still is a system, especially the US variety of it, that can create major problems but has incredible flexibility and endurance. It's the one system that has survived the 20th century while others have gone under. It is malleable, often in wrong directions in terms of causing a lot of harm and pain. But when you look at, let's say, the flow of talent, and that has to do with the innovation and ability to survive and deal, the flows now go in many directions. So it's a multidimensional flow compared to where it was 20, 30, 40 years ago. But the main inflow is into the US. So in a way, the US is the most dynamic emerging market, despite all the flaws that it has, and China's sort of apart because China is obviously an incredible juggernaut going from very low level of economic well-being to a considerably high level, as was mentioned by Joe. And I think the incredible thing about China is that it's a large economy that has managed to do that. Small economies have managed to do that before, but it's the first really gigantic economy. But among the developed countries and the ones that are kind of on the frontier as opposed to catching up with the frontier, the US is a system that should be watched, should be analyzed, and should be in some sense regulated, because it is the beacon that sort of others, whether they want it or not, will be following, competing with, and measuring up to. All right, let's open it up for discussion. The microphone is here. If you can just briefly identify yourself and ask a question. This is such a stimulating material that I can see that everybody's stunned, but don't hesitate, please. Yes.
Walter Goldstein, you talk about the dynamism looking backwards, what you said 30 years ago, we saw now.
Microphone.
The question is, in looking
Is the
forward.
microphone on?
No, there is microphone.
Yeah.
Ask him to speak
Is
to
it
microphone.
on?
Yeah, speak to microphone. Come closer to the microphone.
The
Yeah.
question is, in looking forwards, there's a time limit. There's a shelf life for all of these compromises and this way of being able for national systems to adjust into a regional system or a global system. And the time limits are, first of all, when we get to that point in the environmental argument of climate change, that you go past the point in which you can reverse the build-up of carbon dioxide particles in the atmosphere. Second is on the other parts of the environment. There isn't enough water in the system as we read it for 9 billion people, maybe more than 9 billion people, and that there are other dislocations that will come about because of this. And thirdly, there is the matter of work. Now, the question I put to the panel, would it be better for us to wait until there is a catastrophe, a war, whatever else? The one that we are now looking at is cybernetic war. Easy way of having a Sarajevo incident electronically, out of which grow things. Should we just sit and say, well, we have an interesting discussion, but there is no prescription of what to do. Let's wait till the catastrophe. Or should we say, yes, why don't we start on something or other, whether it's the stabilization of global currencies, or of carbon dioxide emissions, or of the provision of clean water, which is sure to run out. Is this where we should go, or do we just sit and say, hey, that was an interesting disagreement, now we can go up and do other things?
Thank you. We'll collect a few questions, so please come in, and then we'll have the panelists respond.
I think if you're looking at global economies, you see a variety of different kinds of vested interests in those economies. We see in the United States, as Professor Stiglitz likes to point out, pharmaceutical companies, financial institutions, in some sense choking our economies and choking our populations. I am looking at doing some investment in Poland, and there was a recent article in the Financial Times about the power of the state-owned institutions in Poland and how they're sort of choking the ability of foreign investors to feel they can really get a fair shake still, even today in Poland, one of the most successful transition economies. And you have still very large state-owned interests, for example, in the fuel distribution and storage area. They probably have 80, 90% market share because they've still not been privatized. How are we going to change both private and public vested interests so that we can actually free up, the innovation of the individuals and of the entrepreneurs who otherwise are cowed by these vested interests? And can you specifically discuss the situation a little bit in Poland, since we have your expertise here? Thank you.
Thank you. Next one.
John Akaitas, Columbia Law School. This is a question for Professor Stiglitz.
To the microphone, please.
This is a question for Professor Stiglitz. You mentioned IP provisions in the context of free trade discussions that led to stifling of innovation through fragmentation of property rights. Do you think once the regulations are in place, the economists have any tools left to correct for the situation that leads to less innovation and less social welfare?
Thank you. The next participant.
Hello, Pavel Polak. I'm working in the statistics department, doing a lot of risk management. And my question is, if you could identify 3 major risks which especially the financial sector is facing now, and let's call them 3 major uncertainties which economy environment is facing now.
Environment?
Economic environment. All right. If there are no questions on this round, let's let the author and panelists respond. So, Greg, you go first.
Again, the word is extremely complex. I've been recently to countries like Morocco and Western Sahara, Egypt, Sudan, Russia, Ukraine, Turkey, China, Poland, US, UK. Is it feasible, possible to put them in one economic train of thought? That is what I'm trying. I'm talking about the word. So, but I can come to Columbia if you only invite me to give you a semester lecture on Russia or on Arab countries or on emerging China or on decaying Europe. But again, methodologically, there are the things which will happen and which may or may not. And from this perspective, take Europe. You said train crash. 2 or 3 years ago, I contributed a short essay comment on Rubini Global Economics, his blog, his portal, train crash in slow motion, over 2 years ago, vis-a-vis the Greek crisis. I'm not a gambler, but if you will ask me now, as of April 21st, how big is the chance that we'll get rid safely of this crisis? I wouldn't give more than 50%. It is much worse now than it was a quarter ago or a year ago or 2 years ago. Was it unavoidable 2 years ago to come to this very dangerous point? No, not at all. This is the matter of the stupidity of policymakers and economists, where, well, that is very disputable. The question is that we don't have political mechanism to bring together the government of Greece and the people of Greece and Troika, including Germany, which is leading force in this Troika. But from an economic viewpoint, it's a minor issue. Greece is just a country of 10 million people in the world of 7.2 billion people. When Greek crisis started 5 years ago, Greece's deficit was 0.2% of GDP of the European Union. And now this is the challenge. Are we going to survive with the European integration? What is the future for Euro? So the case which was avoidable, say Brexit or collapse of Euro project or
further going European integration with all the consequences for other regional integrations looks completely different now than it was a couple of years ago. Because the things happen. The things happen the way they do because many things happen at the same time. I'm that part of that kind of an economist that I'm trying to find the coincidence of the factors which are behind the failure or success, and then I'm asking the question, when was the turning point that it was going to success or to failure? Joe mentioned the greatest success, maybe the greatest economic success of the history of the mankind, getting 500 million people below over the poverty line in China in one generation. And you mentioned that it has to do something with globalization. Yes, but it has also to do something that the Chinese development was definitely not based on so-called Washington consensus. Yes, it is something to do with the Chinese socialism or socialism with the Chinese characteristics, which you don't like, which we don't like, which very many people don't like, but there is something very special about that. And at the same time, what is very interesting, inequality has increased significantly in China. So on the one hand, it's the greatest success ever, but it's also a very big challenge because inequality in China is unsustainable. It can go for a couple of years, not as long as in the United States, but there is this certain coincidence of the factors. So I'm looking for what coincidence of what factors of culture, technology, politics, environment, and economic matters, of course, may be decisive for certain turn here and there. And from this perspective, this world of now, of us, of today, it's a danger place. It's a danger place. It is much more danger than when Professor Stiglitz was chief economist of the World Bank, when Professor Phelps was getting his Nobel Prize, on when I was a student. There is much more conflicts which are somehow linked to economic issues and sometimes not at all. Not at all. Actually, you know that we are on the verge of military conflict between Iran and US today when we are talking here at Columbia because of the Yemen challenge. You know, it's, there is some background of economics, but it's far from an economic conflict, but it can put all the process in Middle East, all the peace attempts to bring peace over there in disarray. So the things they tend to get out of control. And the question is, do we have the political ability in the interconnected global economy to keep them under control? If we want badly, we do. We do. We have succeeded somehow with non-proliferation till today. We have succeeded somehow till today with controlling the climate, the warming of the climate. At least we keep talking. So for that reason, the process which will now be pushed forward in December in Paris, the global summit on climate control, I put it on the successful side of the story. But if one is asking, Professor Stiglitz, what makes a successful economy? I would say balance, definitely not the level. Balance. I think the critical one is to be in balance. The problems we have, it's not that you have $55,000 per capita, I have $20,000 per capita, and in Sudan they have $2,000 per capita. You've been to Bhutan, I've been to Bhutan, and they are happy people because they are in balance. They are in social balance, in economic balance, and in ecological balance. That is about. So you can be in balance with $100,000 like in Qatar, or with $3,000, or you can get out of balance with your $55,000 per capita, and so on and so on. So I would give much more attention in the future, in my economic thinking and political advice, etc., to take care of keeping the processes in balance, in equilibrium, because crisis is when we are getting out of equilibrium. And I'm coming from the part of the world which was for a generation or two very much affected by shortageflation, or by shortage. That was another kind of disequilibria. Janusz Korney recently has published a book when he's comparing imbalance of socialist type, where the supply is short, with the abundance of the market economy. So what is better from the viewpoint of efficiency? But I think that the critical is equilibrium. So now, there is the question about biggest financial risk or environment risk. Of course, environment risk in the longer run is that the controlling the warming of the climate that the warming of the climate will get out of control, and for the time being, we are on the road to this catastrophic end. But this is manageable. My train of thought is that there are things which are unmanageable, and there are things which are manageable. But if you want to have them manageable, you have to agree that the biggest question for the future, for US, for Poland, for everybody else, and for us, for the mankind, is how to manage the synergy between the power of the government or the governance in the case of work, but because there is not the government in the words, and the market. So I'm very much stressing to the need of governance, of leadership, of intervention, unlike my libertarian or neoliberal colleagues which are saying, okay, you don't know how to solve the problem, leave it to the market. If you want to leave it to the market, this is the recipe for the civilization catastrophe with all the conflicts we have built in the mankind at this stage of development at the beginning of the 21st century. It must be somehow managed, organized, governed, intervened in. And the question is how to do it. So from this perspective, is the West on the decline, as Professor Phelps is saying? I would say that you do not have to expand to be happy. You may stay with your income where you are, but if you are in balance and you are taking care of non-material aspects of development, you do not have to grow by 2, 3, 4% whatsoever. So even if European share to the world economy will be shrinking, it is and it will be. Now it is only 18%, it will be 16, it will be 14, it can be 10, because of raising Asia especially, but also raising Africa for another reasons, etc. Africa will be much more populous soon. They are growing because of the commodity prices, not because of the technological advances, which is the case of Asia. But so relative position of Europe will decline, the same as North America, US. There is the chapter in the book, Eurasia the century of Eurasia with Euro-Atlantic as a background. I'm saying not at all. The word of the future is the multi-pillar word with certain subjects. So the question is how to coordinate the policy, and for that reason G7 is irrelevant and maybe G20 will be somehow helpful. So one more point here is that I do put a trust in regional integration processes, and even with relatively weakening European Union, they are successful stories in Europe all the time. I wouldn't say that there's decline of Austria or Scandinavian social democratic economies. They are doing much better than some other countries, and I think that is a telling story. Why a country like Sweden or Finland is a successful story, and a country like, for instance, Spain and Greece, or even France or Italy, of Italy is not. And this is very much linked to the values. So for the final, yes, well, there's not time to answer all the questions, but I will stop here, and I will repeat just this adage that the things happen the way because many things happen at the same time. So we must be concerned what is going to happen at the same time in the future, and how we may intervene by, first of all, regulation. I think that critical is an institution in behavioral meaning, how to regulate economic activities here and there, being aware that just maximization of profits on microeconomic scale and pace of growth of GDP on macroeconomic scale is not an utmost aim of economic activity. A balanced triple development, that's supposed to be this aim, because as we are saying, I think all of us in the panel for a number of years, very much depends how we measure economic progress, economic expansion, economic development. If we measure it properly, we are much closer to the solution to the problems which we do have. But unfortunately, we still measure our economic situation not in the way it's supposed to be, and I'm trying to address this issue in the books too.
Thanks. Why don't we ask Joe to...
Yeah, I
say
have to
a
leave
few
in 1
words
minute.
since
So,
you have
so,
to
so
run,
let,
yeah.
let me just make two very brief comments. First, there have been a couple in the area of climate, a couple important successes. The most important was the Montreal Convention dealing with the ozone-destroying gases. But the problem of climate change and greenhouse gases, I think, is much more serious. And what's the difference between the two? One of the reasons the difference is the long leg structure. What is affecting climate change is the atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gases, very long leg structures. So we saw the effects of the holes in the ozone layer, and we responded fairly quickly, and they got repaired. The carbon dioxide, the greenhouse gas, is much different. And so the real worry, in my mind, given the long leg structure, is that we will discover that it's not very nice to be frying. And by the time we discover that it's not nice to be frying, it will be too late to unfry ourselves. So that's why I think it is important to do something now, but it's unfortunately very difficult to convince other people. On the question of what do we do given these trade agreements that have the stifling effect on innovation, there are a couple of things. First, as I said before, the most important source of innovation, big innovation, is the basic research that's supported by government. And it seems to me that is outside the purview. And what's important is to keep that part open. And that one can amplify that. One of the things that was very interesting in the article that came out about the aftermath of the Supreme Court decision and the opening up of the innovation in the BRAC was that what they're using a lot is open source. And open source contracts that basically say you can have access to our knowledge if you make your knowledge open. So it's changing the bargaining structure. There's some other areas where that's going on, like in the area of genetic engineering and an alternative to Monsanto's patents. There is an open source platform that is developing. So I think there are ways of dealing with it. Some countries have taken also an active role of making sure that the flexibilities that are in these international agreements through compulsory licenses are taken advantage of. Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you. Ned?
Very briefly, Greg, I'm not arguing that GDP growth ought to be restored as the goal of Europe. Mm-hmm. What I am arguing is that Europe ought to try to regain something they had, large parts of Europe had in the 19th century, which was widespread flourishing. People exploring, trying to invent, trying to innovate, trying to make things, trying to make a better product or make the same product in a better way.
And then they emigrated to America.
No, they didn't. They did fine in France and Germany. Britain, not so clearly. But Europe was right in there in terms of mass flourishing, and in terms of human agency. Some of the most fascinating discussions I've had since my book, Mass Flourishing, is that people have been noticing the discussions of Charles Dickens and all sorts of literary people in the mid-19th century. People were very much, for the first time, on their own, and they were loving it. They were loving the chance to make something of themselves, to have a shot at it, to have a life of richness. And I think it's terribly important for Europe to get back to that.
All right. I think on that note, let's thank you all for coming. Let's thank the panelists. And we can have some more informal discussion with Grzegorz, Kolodko following now the more formal part.
So thank you for coming, and especially the students I would like to invite to continue the debate on blog volatileworld.net, and then there will be more time to raise the issues and to continue the debate. Thank you very much.